when we create value around art, give it a monetary asset value, if art is valuable, people take care of it. And if you make things both valuable in the sense of someone bids for it, but also valuable, as we said, in the market making sense, hey, we're here. We'll always be able to sell it for you. People will care for it, preserve it.
This is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Ming, Chapek, Sartori Viard, and more. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com.
Auction houses, they loom large in the world of watch collecting. Their lots, their eye-popping results, their personalities are all followed feverishly by watch media and enthusiasts. But how much do we really know about these seemingly august, vaunted, and shadowy institutions? How exactly do auction houses work, and what are the implications for the watch community?
Well, today we have the perfect guest to shine a light on the inner working of the auction houses. Marion Maneker, a longtime art world columnist and auction house insider. Marion is the special correspondent for art at Puck, the online news platform where insiders cover the worlds of Wall Street, Washington, Silicon Valley, and Hollywood. Marion was formerly the president of ARTnews, a publisher at HarperCollins, and features editor at New York Magazine. Marion, welcome to Open Work.
Thank you for having me, Guy.
It is absolutely our pleasure. We love the coverage you've been doing on Puck. In fact, it's interesting. A lot of the coverage you've done about the business of the auction houses, which we'll talk about today over the last couple of years, has really resonated with us and as people who are deep in the watch community, not just because auction houses are an important part of the watch community, but there are just so many parallels in general between the broader auction house business and what's been happening in the watch industry over the last couple years. So let's start first just with the landscape of the auction house industry. I know that there are auction houses that people as watch collectors are going to be familiar with, but there's a much broader auction industry than probably what we're familiar with just from the watch world. So can you tell us a little bit about who are the major players in the auction industry and kind of what their key departments or categories are?
Sure. The global auction industry is different from the local or regional auction industry. And since the expansion in wealth in Asia, there are now many more Asian auction houses than there were in the past. And though the two main auction houses with global reach, Sotheby's and Christie's, are the dominant players in many ways across this entire industry, it's important to remember that auction is just a way of selling, a type of selling. So you can have auction houses that will never touch a work of art. You can have auction houses that, it's important to remember there's auction businesses in like cattle and real estate. I mean, there's all sorts of industries that use auction as a way of, finding the right price. And I guess that's the first place to start. What auction is about price discovery. If you're selling things that are non-commensurate, or if you're selling objects that are unique, even if they are similar to other objects, it is very hard. It's not a commodity. It's very hard to find a price and establish a price. And so instead of just saying this costs X, you bring it to auction and find out on that day who wants it and how much do they want it for. And remember, it helps maybe to remember that these are very old companies, Christie's and Sotheby's, and Phillips to some extent, and Bonhams. They were all sort of founded in the late 18th century, and that was because people had property that needed to be sold, but you really couldn't price it. It wasn't horseshoes, it wasn't iron, it wasn't a bale of hay. It was very hard to price, so you held auctions and came up with the right price for it. So in the art world, which then has underneath it a lot of things that used to be sold by the auction houses, they call it brown furniture, but it's all that carved wood furniture from, that people think of as antiques from the 16th century forward, and many other objects Those things were sold by Christie's and Sotheby's. Then around the turn of the century, Bernard Arnault had tried to buy Sotheby's, couldn't, and as a consolation, went out and found a relatively small British auction house called Phillips and partnered with someone who had worked at Sotheby's, Simone de Pury, and he invested in building up this auction house, Phillips de Pury, originally Phillips de Pury in Luxembourg. Eventually, that got sold to some guys called the Mercury Group, who are Russian mall real estate developers. In the art world, the universe is Sotheby's, Christie's, and Phillips. And then people think of those as being the dominant players. There are some Asian auction houses that are quite big, Poly and China Guardian. And then in the sort of broader world of collectibles, there's an enormous powerhouse in Dallas called Heritage Auctions that sells, they sell art too, but they predominantly sell coins, comic books, sports memorabilia, Hollywood memorabilia, long lists of different types of objects. And they've been extraordinarily successful at making markets in those kinds of, we call it now cultural property. And I would say there's Bonhams is a medium-sized player, has a big car business, vintage, antique, classic car business. There are players. I mean, then we can get into there are players just in the car business and so on. But when we think about the world that connects with the art world, the biggest players are Sotheby's, Christie's, Heritage, Phillips, Bonhams to some extent, and then some regional players.
Maybe this is an obvious thing, so if it is, forgive me. But listening to you talk, I mean, it makes perfect sense. If a sculptor has made a single work of art, or if a painter has made a single painting, etc., it makes sense what you're describing around determining a market in this way. I imagine there are certain examples of artwork that exist in multiple copies, a print or what have you. But the majority of what you're describing are individual objects. In our world, those exist, of course. We sell independent watches. Independent watches occasionally exist as piece uniques, or there are, a limited number of pieces that were created by an Abraham Louis Breguet or what have you. But modern day auction houses, at least in our world, are selling to a degree some commoditized product for which a market price already exists. And I'm curious to explore that a little bit. So I'll give you an example. In our world, one watch that appears at auction all the time and is not by definition super rare is a Patek Philippe 5711, a Nautilus. This is a watch that can be found in multiple places for sale at any given time, and there is a set market price. And yet, it goes to auction. And I wonder, in this scenario, I can understand the logic of why a seller would bring it to auction. Everybody wants the most they can get for what they've got. But I'm curious, how does an auction house look at something when it is a commoditized product? And what is their role in defining what makes that object unique and therefore commanding the attention it will get versus the standard market deciding what a value is?
I think that's an excellent insight. And one of the things I should say is about 10 years ago, the auction houses basically got rid of all that brown furniture and the Victorian antiques and said, we're not selling that stuff. It's too cheap. It costs too much to sell. We're going to sell luxury, secondhand, vintage, luxury items. Now, they already had watch businesses, and those seem to, I think, your universe has sort of eaten away at their ability to have a strong watch program to varying degrees. But they also, handbags, wine, jewelry, these luxury items were a big part of the growth. And now they account for, at the big auction houses, as much as Sotheby's just announced yesterday, that luxury is 37% of their business. So more than a third. Christie's, I think it's closer to around 20% or in the low to 20s. And there is some question if you want to be known as an art auctioneer, is it dangerous to get too much selling luxury items? But that is a lead up to saying these are double-sided marketplaces. Everyone forgets the auction house is a fiduciary for the seller. They are in business to represent the seller and realize the best price for the seller. That is their legal obligation. That is their business. But the power of the auction houses, especially over the last 15 or 20 years, has been to become an entry point for people who are interested in art and luxury items. Because they have these famous brands and have been around for a long time and have offices all over the world. And because in the case of the art world, but I think even your world where, you're dealing with secondhand dealers who, have some good stuff in the vault, but won't necessarily tell you how much they have. Oh, this is the last one, but there's, two more that they're waiting to sell to the next guy who's, oh, this is the last one. Because there's not enough transparency in these things, people have gravitated towards going to the auction houses as a point of entry. You made some money, you think, hey, I want an upgrade in life. I'm going to go get some of the cool stuff I see rich people have now that I am a rich person. It's easier to walk into Sotheby's because, they got a front door and they have a lot of publicity.
So, okay, so that's interesting. One thing that just popped into my head as you were saying that was about the role of auction houses in provenance. And that's an interesting question because from our standpoint, and we're a primary market dealer, so the majority of what we sell are new objects. However, when we talk to our friends who are big in the vintage watch world, for example, provenance is always a question that comes up. What is the role of an auction house when it comes to provenance?
Well, that's one of the reasons people go to the auction houses, especially if they're new to all of this, is the auction houses have a responsibility to protect their buyers under a warranty clause in what they deal with. So the New York regulation require, I believe, 4+1. So 4 years after they sell anything, if you can prove that it's a fake, the auction houses are by law required, not just it's good business and smart for them, but by the law, they are required to give you your money back. That's a strong reason to go do business with someone because they'll still be in business. They've been around for 280 years. They'll still be here, 3 or 4 years from now. And you can stand on your hind legs, and they've got a reputation to protect and yell and scream, "You sold me this fake!" And we've had some very important cases that have gone to court, and there's a whole thing that brings all this stuff together that makes it very valuable to deal with an auction house. So you might want to pay more there for that reason because you can get some protection from it. But it's also, and I was going to say this to you earlier about your earlier question. Yes, they are responsibilities to the seller, but they've built up their businesses by saying, we want to have strong relationships with all of these buyers. And so that trust factor of like, hey, I know I can walk into Sotheby's and I either have a salesperson there or a good relationship with them, sometimes makes it easier to say, oh, I see that watch. I've always wanted one of those. Yeah, you could do more research. You could go find it for a little bit less. But, I like working with these guys. And so you'll bid on that when it comes up. And yeah, it might cost you a little bit more, but there's a nice wrapper around it that makes it feel comfortable to be in that, Christie's Sotheby's universe.
It's interesting you bring this up. And by the way, I had no idea about the warranty thing. None whatsoever. In fact, my perspective was, well, heck, the job of the auction house, as you said, is to be a fiduciary of the seller. And really the interests they're fundamentally looking out for are those of the seller and I guess themselves because they want to make some money out there. They're in business. Had no idea about the warranty. And I think that's an important point. In the last few years, as auctions have really gained much more visibility in the watch world, probably the most famous example would be, I believe it was in 2017, I hope I'm getting this right, that Phillips auctioned off Paul Newman Daytona. That was obviously a huge moment in the watch community, but I think a cultural moment more broadly for watches because of the sum that very special watch commanded. It sort of put watches and the auction results of watches into a much, made that apparent to a much broader audience, like that's a thing. And since then, there's been, and I think this is a good thing, there should be watchdogs, but there's been a lot of scrutiny and skepticism among watch enthusiasts about provenance and authenticity of watches being sold at auction. The most famous example being just a couple of years ago, Omega famously purchased a vintage Omega Speedmaster from Philips that turned out to be a fake. And this was a watch that they paid over $3 million for. And I don't know what the outcome of that was, or where that went in terms of legal action, but this was a huge scandal. And it was uncovered by members of the watch community. It was frankly uncovered by an Instagram account who was able to identify that this watch was what we call a Franken watch. It wasn't actually an authentic watch. It was an assemblage of different components from different watches, some of which had been manipulated.
Some of which I think were even stolen from the Omega Museum, if I recall correctly. Or so insinuated.
I don't know the particulars, but this is a huge scandal. And when you combine that with this notion that, well, the auction houses are really just a fiduciary for the seller, it created this sense in the watch community and among enthusiasts that like auction houses can't be trusted. So I guess the question here is, I would imagine this comes up in other categories or other departments in auctions. And I would imagine there are scandals even bigger than this Omega Speedmaster scandal. How do auction houses, and I would imagine this is something they've been dealing with, to your point, for centuries, how do auction houses actually deal with these issues of authenticity? What happens? How do they make it right? What checks and balances do they have in place? Because it would seem it's really not in their best interest in terms of reputation or frankly legally to have fakes. So what are the quality controls, and how do auction houses actually deal with these issues of provenance? Because I think the perception is in the watch world, they get a watch, they don't care where it came from, they put it up for sale, and they try to get as much as they can.
I would say, I don't know the watch business in particular, though, it's important to point out that Philips's watch division is run by Oral Box, who was Christie's watch division. And because of some internal stuff that happened at Christie's and he felt poorly treated and his old boss was now at Philips, Oral moved his business over there, much to his advantage. And so he's got a slightly different situation in the sense that like he's got more clout than more guys would be in another company. But, again, the reason you have a corporation is to use your balance sheet to be able to deal with these kinds of issues. And so you have internal controls and processes, but you also have the external, hey, in worst case scenario, we will solve this problem because it's in our interest, our reputation. As a friend of mine in the insurance business says, sometimes the best marketing is paying out a claim. Sometimes the best marketing for the auction house is to give someone their money back and say, we'll take care of it. We'll figure it out. It's our problem, not yours. So, and look, I don't know the legal history of where the warranties come from, but I would not be surprised if they are weirdly a counterbalance to the fiduciary responsibility to the seller, meaning, okay, we can't have these guys just be responsible to the seller. We need to give them some requirement that protects the buyer. And that requirement is if someone comes back to you with proof and they limit it to 4 years, it's not forever. Can't come in 30 years later, 100 years later. Hey, Christie's, you sold this to me, my grandfather, you owe me, the money back. So internally, to answer your question, auction houses were really built around specialists, people who are experts in their field, who know what the really good stuff is. Now, some of that is to protect against fakes. Some of that is there are things that are just, a painting comes in and someone rubs on it a little bit and says, I think this is something, else. The most famous example of that is the Salvator Mundi by Leonardo that was sold for $450 million, was found in a small auction in New Orleans by Robert Simon and a group of other guys who were like, there's something about this painting. I don't know what it is. They paid, I don't know, can't remember, it was 90,000, something, some amount of money for it. Then they spent a lot of money doing research, getting it cleaned up, getting it restored. Then they had trouble selling it for a number of years for what they thought it was worth. I think they sold it for $80 million, which is an extraordinary amount of money to begin with. And of course, it shows you how the art world works. They're like, well, but that's not what we wanted. We thought it was worth more. And then when it sells for 450 million,
yeah, it makes watch collecting look like pocket change.
but then they're mad when it sells for 450 million. Hey, wait a second, that was ours, and you get these kinds of things. So it's the responsibility of the auction house, the expert, to be able to say, yeah, that doesn't look right. Maybe we shouldn't, or you don't have the right documentation, you don't have the right paperwork, because how do these things get determined? They get determined in a court ultimately. And so if you're running a business, you're like, we can't go to court every week over everything we sell. So we need to have, some assurance that what we're selling is not going to come back. Yes, will there be isolated examples? Will things happen? I don't know that situation with the Speedmaster at all, but things also either they get duped themselves, or, as we all do, everyone gets overly excited and ignores some red flags that they should have seen up front. But when you're running a business, you don't want to be known for selling fake. It really doesn't help bring people in for the next sale, and that is one of the limiting factors there.
So let's talk a little bit about the role of anonymity in auctions. And there's a couple of ways that I look at that, right? There's the anonymity of the bidders, the anonymity of the consignees, the sellers. And then there's also this other interesting little bit, which I only discovered myself awkwardly, which is the anonymity, hypothetically, of the original owners of some of this work. So I'll give you an example of that one from my own personal history. I once owned a Patek Philippe watch, which I bought new. And Patek Philippe paperwork has your name and your address on it. And I found in my travels over the years that watch, which I sold, has ended up at auction, where my name and my former address is presented for all to see. Now, one could argue that that's important information for a buyer, right? But of course, that has got to be one of the easiest ways to plan a home invasion that could ever possibly be done. So I'm curious, when you work with, or when in your travels in working with auction houses, what do they see the value of protecting the anonymity of buyers and sellers? Like, why is that, when it is used, why is that used? Because in our world, for example, we often hear that the buyers, the bidders themselves, are protected by the auction houses, and only the buyer can choose to reveal who they are. We still don't know who bought the Paul Newman, so to speak. At least not there are guesses, but we don't know. And then how do people think about the ethics of protecting the original owners of some of these products? And is that even an ethical thing that they need to contend with?
In my dealing with the people at the auction houses, their bias is towards, we're telling you nothing unless we have to or we've been told to. So in certain cases, the provenance, the seller, adds value. And that's how you get these named collection sales, because, Ann Bass adds value. David Rockefeller adds value. People don't want to just buy the painting. They also want a painting that was owned by David Rockefeller and it's worth more. But that's something that the seller authorizes. To be honest with you, it's funny. That's a really good question. I don't know what the either ethics or rules are about deeper provenance. So it's one thing for you to, in the auction catalog, they list previous owners. And, if they know the name, they try and put it because it gives people confidence. Sometimes they will put, bought by, either by descent, or they will be bought at this sale but not name, or a private collection or something like that. Once you buy the work, I don't know what your rights are to know the complete provenance. And also, by the way, once you sell the work, what are your privacy rights to keep your name out of it? I don't know. I do know that the auction houses will always err on the side of, we're not telling you nothing. It's a lot safer. We can't get into trouble if we didn't tell you. We can get in trouble if we did, and it turns out we shouldn't. On the buyer side, there's a couple of reasons not for anonymity. One, you know, as you pointed out, in all sorts of ways, people become targets. It's not just someone, if you buy the Paul Newman Daytona, that someone might come to your house and look for your Daytona, or think, well, if you bought that, think of all the other things you have. But I think there's also people are going to come to you and try and sell you other watches. And so if you're the auction house, why do you want to annoy your customer and also have someone try and get in front of you because you want to go and sell them more? Hey, you bought that Daytona. I've got a couple other things for you.
This was something that I was wondering about too when they talk about protecting the seller, et cetera, is how much of that is about ensuring that conquesting doesn't take over the industry? Because one would imagine that someone could go to, someone who's got a massive collection and say, I'll work with you with a much lower seller's premium, or I'll, as we've seen in the past, and this backfired recently, we'll guarantee certain amounts no matter what. This backfired, I believe, last year during the Geneva auctions with a fairly catastrophic auction. And I'm curious, like, how is conquesting handled in this industry? And what I mean by that is, you have three dominant houses, as you pointed out. I'm sure they're all competing in many cases for the business of the broader art world, watch collecting world, etc. What keeps a client at an auction house, and what motivates a client to leave? And I'm going to exclude results from that. Are there relationships that are built? Is there scholarship that is done? Like, what keeps someone at a Sotheby's, for example, other than just the results?
Well, I think there are people who only deal with one auction house. I suspect there are fewer of them as time goes on. And, again, people have their person there. They have a good relationship on both the buying and selling side. And so you develop these positive relationships. Like, no, I just like to work with my person. But in general, it's a highly competitive business, and they're generally working with the same pool of people. And so, as we often joke about this business, and there's been this whole issue with Sotheby's recently, with they changed their fee structure. They've had a rough year in 2024. I don't think anyone thinks that they can't turn around now that they've gone back to the old fee structure. In fact, made it a little fatter, that they are not going to go out and be able to buy market share by cutting deals. So a lot of it is someone just comes to you and says, we'll make you a better deal than the other guys. And that's how you ended up with the price fixing scandal in the late 1990s. Is they were, the CEO of Christie's, Christopher Davidge, was trying to deal with the fact that they were undercutting each other. And so they made a secret deal, which is not illegal in the UK, but is illegal in the United States. And bizarrely, the CEO of Sotheby's, who was not directly involved in it, is the guy who went to jail for that. So there's a lot of pressure to try and stop the price undercutting. But, everyone has relationships with the business in this business, but when you talk to them, nobody thinks those relationships will trump a better deal from the other side.
Kind of related to that, and one of the most kind of beloved topics on this podcast, just in terms of, where we see a lot of downloads, is kind of like the state of the market for X, Y, or Z. And we've talked a lot about the state of the market for watches, both new and pre-owned. We've talked a lot about the state of the luxury industry and the luxury holding companies like Richemont and LVMH more broadly. And I get why people want to know that. I mean, it's news, it's topical. These are the companies we're buying stuff from, so it's kind of good to know, like, are they going to be around? Are they doing well? Can I get a deal? That kind of thing. But we haven't ever talked at all about the kind of the finances and the business and the state of the business of the auction industry. And I would imagine it's been a turbulent few years, just guessing. So I'd love to hear, Marion, like, how are these luxury houses doing? What is the state of the industry?
Well, that's very interesting. I think it goes up and down, and the way the market changes has a lot of effect on the health of these companies. And of course, one of the issues with this whole industry is there's lots of people who want to be involved in art and luxury items broadly defined. So there's always someone to buy either the business or the stock of the business that tends to overvalue the businesses from a financial point of view. So if you are Francois Pinault, who owns Christie's, you own it because you want the business to do well and you want it to return, a profit to you. But there are other reasons you want to own that business. He's a very passionate art collector, and he bought it in 1998 as a window into the art world. And it gives you kind of special access because you've got all these people who spend all their time talking to everyone who owns art. So there's kind of like a microscope on the art world, or at least, you've got your own CIA, the art world, as it were. So you can see if you're going to spend a lot of money on art, as Monsieur Pinault ended up doing, there's a great value to owning an auction house. And if you can make a profit on it at the same time, that's great. But maybe you're not so concerned, like, hey, you guys got to make more profit next year when you're getting this other benefit from it. For a long time, Sotheby's was a public company, which put them in a different situation. Having a stock price and shareholders means you've got to, report your numbers, and you've got to adjust to what people are saying and how they're trading the stock. Phillips is privately owned by this Russian luxury real estate group, but they too, again, everyone's got their own, choices that they make about this. There was a period in the growth of the auction houses in that sort of period of like 2004, 5, 6, when the contemporary art market really started to explode and prices were changing rapidly. You mentioned, Asher, guarantees. One of the real innovations in the auction business was recognizing, hey, we have better market intelligence than others because we've got so many people touching so many clients. We can identify a work of art over here that we know there are buyers for over there, and the seller doesn't quite know how much it's worth. We can go in and say, hey, we will guarantee you that we'll sell this for $1 million, knowing that they've got someone on the other side who's willing to pay $1.5 million. And then that enables them to get a better deal on the actual sale. That worked great in 2007 and even early 2008. The global financial crisis kind of blew that apart, and they suffered some losses. But there was a brief period where they were making a lot of money because they were guaranteeing things well. We went through a bunch of different cycles. Actually, the last few years, directly guaranteeing and having third-party guarantees has been one of the ways they've improved the business. Sotheby's has always had a sophisticated financing arm, Sotheby's Financial Services. So they were able to use, again, their market expertise and position in the market to loan people money against art directly and have an inside line on selling that art if it needed to be, the loan needed to be satisfied. So there are ways to improve your financial performance, not directly related to the competition.
I'm curious because that's fascinating. Does that mean that any auction houses will allow bidders to finance purchases, or do they not do that?
Yes, they do it through a mechanism called an irrevocable bid or a third-party guarantee. And the way that works is I've got a consignor who wants to sell, again, just because it's a round number, their $1 million painting. But they're reluctant to sell. What if no one buys it? And then everyone's going to laugh at me, and no one will want to buy my painting again because it was for sale and no one wanted it. It's being called burned in the parlance of the industry. So right after the global financial crisis, they came up with this mechanism. It was actually earlier, but it really came into full use of the third-party guarantee, where they would say to people, hey, if you consign this, we've got someone who will guarantee you $1 million, but we'll also bring it to auction. And if it turns out there's someone out there who wants to pay $1.5 million, we'll find that person for you. The only thing you need to give up is some of the upside. So if you take this $1 million from this third-party guarantor and it sells for 1.5, you're going to pay them a percentage of the overage, as it's called. So, that's a perfectly legitimate financing fee for taking risk out of the system. And that has worked very well, especially on very high end works of art, to give validation to the work. Hey, someone's going to buy this, right? And also to give the seller this kind of sense of, I compare it to in investment banking, there's like a go shop period where it's like, we think this is the right deal, but if you don't believe us, hey, go ask other people, but this is what we've negotiated and we're prepared to pay.
What are the relationships like on the art side of the auction world of artists themselves to the art, to the living artists, obviously, to the auction houses? In our world, for example, we regularly see some of the masters of independent watchmaking present at the auctions of their own works. So this has certainly been the case for guys like F.P. Journe, who have bought back, in some cases, some of their pieces. I've also seen this with other sort of darlings of the indie watch world, like Recep Rezepi. Like, these are guys who's Philippe Dufour. These are guys whose work have become the stuff of legends, who are alive and who, in some cases, are very much at the beginning of their career, like Recep versus someone who's older, like Philippe Dufour. And I have to imagine that the folks who are consigning these watches and who are professing to be knowledgeable about these works have a relationship with the artist. But I'm curious about the ethics of that too, because one could make an argument that there could be collusion there, where someone could arguably push value up on something which may or may not have that value. So I'm curious for that.
No. That's not. That is a standard thing done in the art world. What you want to do when a work of art is sold at auction is you want someone in the auction room who is bidding up to what they think is the right value. In the old days, it was your dealer would go to the auction and say, oh, that's so cheap, I'm happy to buy that and keep it in inventory because I've got buyers who will pay for it. And they will bid and keep bidding until you reach a price where it's like, no, okay, you can have it, because that's better than the people I know who are talking to me about it. But also that's, supporting your market, making sure things don't get too cheap. And I know at least of one artist who has someone who does that for their work. Again, on the same idea, like, hey, people come to us, so we're happy to own it at this price. And, with dead artists, it gets done all the time. The funny part is you want to be seen doing it, right? You want people to know, I'm out there, I'm going to support this market, because it gives people much more confidence in prices. It can be done behind the scenes. You have lots of telephone bidders. Now we have internet bidders. But, if you win, you got to pay. So everyone acts like, oh, it's easy to do or cost free. You actually have to have the money to buy the work. And if you're going to buy the work, you got to hope that you can sell it for more than you paid for later on. I think the other thing that's worth pointing out is artists in 2008, Damien Hirst had a big sale where he sold a ton of artwork, like $200 million worth of it, directly at auction. And there are still, you can see things.
These were new works?
Yeah, these were new works. He was like, why should I sell through my dealers when I could just sell straight to people who want my stuff? The lesson was, don't do it. It destroyed his market. Yeah. Lehman Brothers failed the same day as his auction, so that might add something to do with things there. I mean, there's other reasons around it. But the point being is, like, there are artists who are quietly selling things directly at auction. And you really have to know your stuff to go through the provenance to be able to see that. And there's nothing wrong with it, but it's not, it's rarely disclosed immediately. Hey, we're doing this direct from the studio.
That's fascinating. I had no idea. We certainly know well in the watch world, as Asher was saying, that watchmakers or brands will buy their stuff either because they want to have a floor on bidding or, they may want something for a museum, whatever it might be.
You guys discussed this recently about Cartier, and this is one of the reasons that Rolex and Patek Philippe are the most valuable watches, because of the registration, because there is an existing company foundation supporting and keeping an eye on it. Though that's how you get value in secondary markets. They don't happen by magic. There has to be someone actively coordinating these things in a way that makes the market stable.
Absolutely. I think, it's easy for people to be cynical, right? And say how horrible that Rolex or Patek Philippe or anyone is bidding, for instance, at an auction on their own stuff. However, it does benefit the people who own that stuff as well, right? They're establishing a floor. They're making sure there's a strong market for it. So it does cut both ways.
Making a market is an important thing. And when you're the seller, when you own that Rolex, and if you go to auction, at least Rolex will buy it. And maybe you get 85% of your money out of it, still better than nothing. And that was, by the way, the New York Stock Exchange was built on market makers who were required to buy shares that people wanted to sell. They didn't have to buy them at a great price, but they had to buy them. And then they would hold on to them. With luck, someone would come wanting to buy them for higher than that they had to purchase them for. But that's the market maker's role. They get a fee for taking the risk of being matching when buyers and sellers don't match, of adding time so that they ultimately can be matched. And having a good company that's willing to do that, it is an enormous value add in any secondary market.
Well, speaking of those kind of market makers, what I was really wondering about, and I had no idea about, was the role of dealers. Now, oftentimes I think people, especially in the watch world at least, think about dealers and auction houses as purely being competitors, right? If I have a watch to sell or there's a watch I want to buy, I can buy it from a dealer or I can buy it through an auction. And there are a lot of dealers, and it's not surprising, who are quite frankly very outspoken against the auction industry, at least in the watch world. In fact, some of them were former auction house specialists who say, I'm a reformed auction house specialist. The auction houses are so terrible. That's why I'm a dealer and blah, blah, all that sort of stuff. But one of the things you pointed out is there can be a role for dealers within market making and just as people who are buying at auction. Everyone knows watch dealers go to auction. So what is the relationship between dealers and auction houses? Is it adversarial? Are they frenemies? Do they help and benefit one another? How exactly does it really work behind the scenes in terms of the way dealers and auction houses relate to one another?
So this is a fascinating and great subject because it has changed over time. There was a time when the biggest concern about auctions was not what the auctioneers were doing. It was that the dealers were all getting together before the auction, deciding who would take what and suppressing the bidding. Those dealer rings were a real issue and people were prosecuted for that. I mean, this is going back 70, 100 years and longer. So, and as I said earlier, the auction houses primarily used to be an exchange among dealers. The dealers had the clients. The collector went and said, hey, I'm interested in, Rembrandt. You went to a guy who sold a lot of Rembrandts and he would educate you and you'd say, well, I really want one of these. Do you have one? No, but I know where I can get one. And then he'd go and at the next auction, he'd see a Rembrandt, know he had a client, and he'd bid more because he knew he could sell it to that person. And that was what the auction houses were concentrating on. We're just getting stuff in between these guys. And then post 2000 especially, they really opened up to bringing in more retail clients. And for a long period, there was an enormous amount of animosity between dealers, primary and secondary. So people selling art that just came out of the artist studio, people selling art that a collector owned and wanted to sell to another collector, that's secondary. Both of those felt like they were fighting with the auction houses for clients. And so it got very bitter. And for a long time, Art Basel exploited that. They, presented themselves as the champions of individual galleries against those horrible auction houses. Then there was a period in like 2013 when nobody knew what a price was for a work of art because they've been rising rapidly. And someone would go to a dealer and they'd say, I really want that, but gee, it seems like you want too much for it. And the dealer's like, no, this is what it's worth. And they'd say, well, I don't know. I just don't feel comfortable, with that price. So the dealer would take the work to an auction, put it at auction. Now the same person has to risk someone else buying it. And then they see someone else bidding on it. They're like, oh, I guess that was a good price. And they end up spending more because they see someone else bidding for it. So now the whole world is fairly integrated. People will acquire works at auction and sell them to people later. Again, that same sort of time differential. And now you have the problem when someone comes in and says, well, you only paid, this much for it. Why do I have to, pay you so much more? It's like, well, because I own it now. and I've been sitting on it for X amount of time. And so that symbiosis, I think, is much more greatly recognized. There's always going to be tension. Everyone always wants to get it. You're competing for customers. You're competing for goods, right? If someone walks into my, watch shop and wants to sell me a watch and I say, oh, this is great, it's worth $10,000. And they go to the auction house and the auction house says, oh, we can sell it for $15,000. Then I'm going to be mad at that, especially if they don't sell it because it really was worth $10,000. But as you mentioned earlier, as our early example is, price is not so efficient or visible. And you get these uneven prices in different places. You never know who's going to walk in the door. And so everyone's always got half an eye on the other people. They're what's it, coopetition. They're integrated, but they're also fighting each other.
So as you look to the future, what do you think the greatest need and the greatest innovation that has yet to happen in this space is? I mean, this is a business that's existed, as you pointed out, for centuries, and it's evolved over time. But when you look to what an auction house might look like in the year 2100, what do you think that difference may be? Or do you think that this business is so finely honed and is humming along right now that this structure is the one that works?
Well, it's funny. This goes back to your earlier question, and I'm not sure I fully answered it. There was a period where the auction houses were doing well and expanding. Last couple of years, the auction houses have been under a lot of pressure, declining sales at auction. They've actually been selling a lot privately, and a lot of competition around pricing and all. So I don't think Sotheby's has gone through a bad patch recently. I don't know how, Christie's is owned by a huge company with a lot of money, but I think they're under pressure to make money. There's been, since the success of luxury goods, there's been a lot of hope, and Sotheby's has really oriented itself to being a luxury good retailer. And they've had some success in it, but it's also come at certain costs. And as I mentioned, is 37% the right amount? Should it be higher? Should it be lower? What does that do to the other businesses you're trying to be in? So the one big question is, how do these luxury goods play out? As I think you guys discussed on other podcasts, we saw peak luxury goods about 2-3 years ago. Now, this may be a slight trough and then there's another leg up, or it might be that was the top of it. How many Birkin bags can you entice people to buy at, whatever the price is? How many, Rolex watches? And by the way, Rolex actually functions the way an art gallery does. There's a price, but you can't actually walk in and buy something at a Rolex store. Same thing at an art gallery. They're required to list a price, but you can't force them to sell you a painting no matter how much you want. And so that creates secondary market pressure because the highest bidder just gets the thing in the secondary market. Will that always be the case? Will that always be the answer? Are the auction houses luxury good retailer? Is art a luxury item? I mean, we could do podcasts on each one of those questions. I think again, it's much more about auction as a price discovery function and about aggregating clients, right? So what the auction houses are very good at is getting this group of people who are interested in Damien Hirst and saying, "Oh, if you like Damien Hirst, I've got a Takashi Murakami for you. I've got, or let me get you into Calder or, some other artist." And so that's been the place where they've been successful. And I suspect it will continue to be around more things of cultural property, right? Because people are buying, when you buy art in an emotional way, when you buy a lot of these things, you're trying to capture something that is both unique to you, but also gives you a relationship to something extraordinary. There's a reason that, in Asian works of art, if something was created in an imperial workshop and might have sat on an emperor's desk or been among the effects, it's going to be worth a whole lot more. Why? Everyone wants to feel this special connection to someone in history that was powerful and important. And if you can't, and that's why a lot of artwork sells. Like, here's this famous artist, and I'm holding the object that they made. It puts me, in this extraordinary connection to it. So I think that's where that business will sort of always gravitate towards, is making that connection between buyers and sellers. But, there's no telling. These companies look nothing like they did, 75 years ago. So I don't know what they're going to look like in another 30 years.
As a total side note, and from a completely different school of scholarly work, what you're talking about does remind me. Are you familiar with the scholar Sherry Turkle? You ever come across her?
Oh, of course. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I remember I think it was the first, many years ago, I read The Second Self. And of course, in that context, she's talking more about people's connection to inanimate objects as it relates to computers. But there always was that interesting question of theirs: what is the difference between a pen and my pen? And, what are the relationships that are formed there with these objects and the depth of that? And I've always found that to be particularly remarkable. So it makes a lot of sense what you're describing in that context. Before we close here, I wonder if you could share one final thought with folks that are listening as they consider the importance of auction houses. We've talked about it a great deal here from a financial and from a business standpoint. But I'm also curious what their role is in the preservation of art and the preservation of unique works. Because so many names have crossed our lips in this, whether it's Picasso or Jorn or what have you. These are important artists and makers in different fields. What is the role of an auction house in preservation?
I'm glad you asked that, because I think this is under-recognized. So I mentioned earlier that Phillips was bought by Arnault and a guy named Simon de Pury, who was an auctioneer and had worked at Sotheby's, and then he was an advisor to an important Spanish collection. And Simon de Pury has made, I think, a really interesting and somewhat under-recognized comment about this. When we create value around art, give it a monetary asset value, which people often decry how terrible, this is what. And I understand why they do. And we certainly these days reduce everything to a price, which is absolutely idiotic, because these things are not valuable because of their prices. They're valuable for all these other reasons. And the price is just a mechanism for how they get distributed from one person to another. But de Pury's point was, if art is valuable, people take care of it. And if you make things both valuable in the sense of someone bids for it, but also valuable, as we said, in the market making sense, hey, we're here, we'll always be able to sell it for you. People will care for it, preserve it, look for more works. One of the things we talk about with artists is, if you get big prices, it pulls out all this other sometimes lost works. Something sitting in someone's attic where they're like, oh, that old painting. And then you're like, oh my God, this is a so-and-so, and we get these
This old thing.
rediscoveries. Yes, and then I guarantee you, the Salvator Mundi, plenty of people have gone through auctions going, maybe this is another Leonardo. When you see those kinds of numbers, you pay attention. It's like buying a lottery ticket. Like, you pay attention to something that is fundamentally irrational. You're not going to win the lottery, but you see it's at the Mega Millions is $1 billion. You're like, hey, let's go buy 10 lottery tickets and all. It's the same thing with this. Let's look twice at that painting. Don't throw it out. It might be something that valuable. People are on the lookout for the specific things because they're now valuable. So I do think that is a very valid point that probably needs to be made more. We give people such greater incentive to preserve things. And by the way, that's also an argument, and this is somewhat heresy, for the private ownership of art. Museums are overtaxed with the amount of art they have, right? A lot of it is most of it, the vast majority is sitting in storage somewhere, which may be good for it, may not be good for it. There is a case to be made for liberating a lot of that art, getting in the hands of individuals who will take care of it, who are better stewards for it because they've got some sort of emotional and financial investment in it.
I love this because it reframes the way I think cynics, and I am a cynic, look at this, which is this idea of like, well, if that watch or that artwork or what have you disappears into a private collection, we'll never see it again. But your point is, well, did it disappear or is it now being preserved? That's a completely new way for me to think about it. So thank you for that.
Well, it also reframes the good old watch collector and watch enthusiast chestnut, which is, the best way to own a watch is to wear it and enjoy it. Well, this sort of calls that into question, right? If you have a watch that's really special, is the best thing to wear it, enjoy it, and beat the heck out of it? Or is the best thing to preserve it? Now, I don't know the answer to that question, but it's very thought-provoking. And I think it's easy for enthusiasts, and count me among them, to say, if you have a watch, you should wear it and enjoy it. And if that's not what you're doing with it, you're wasting your time and wasting everyone's time, and someone else should have it who can enjoy it.
Going back to what you were saying earlier, think of all of the Daytonas that guys went to their dad's old effects or the safety deposit box, or even would troll through, secondhand stores and pawn shops because the original Paul Newman sold for so much and everyone got interested in Daytonas. And for every Daytona that sold new, there were plenty more out there that people rediscovered because they now knew that they were valuable.
The good old Rolex Daytona. Probably no better place to end this podcast than there. But look, Marion, this has been an absolutely eye-opening and fascinating conversation. We have learned a ton, and not only have we learned a ton, but it's forced us to question some pretty ingrained assumptions. And that's the whole point of this. And we really do appreciate that. And we appreciate you. Thank you for joining us.
It has been entirely my pleasure, guys. I really have enjoyed this conversation.
And thank you for listening. Open Work is a production of Collective Horology. You can find us online at collectivehorology.com, and you can find our guest, Marion Maneker, and his writing at puck.news. To get in touch with questions, feedback, or suggestions, just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.